Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Building Successful Partnerships. Before I hand it over to our moderator for today, I just want to go through a few things with you. First, you are all in listen-only mode. This is to limit ambient noise and feedback during the presentation. Today's session is being recorded. Everyone will be sent a copy of that recording, so if you miss something, you can watch it again. Some organizations do block the GoToWebinar launch window, so you might have some sound or visual issues. We suggest if they persist that you join us by phone. Lastly, we will have time at the end of the session for questions, so please use the question box to ask questions throughout the presentation, and I will pass them on to the moderator. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Shannon Day, the Dean of Arts at the University of Regina, who will be presenting and leading our panelist discussion for today.
Thanks very much, Emily, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is, as you know, the third session in a three-part series exploring how to do research that has real impact. This session the whole series is sponsored by Future Skills Center and Research Impact Canada, and is brought to you by the Community Engagement and Research Center at the University of Regina and the Canadian Institute of Public Safety Research and Treatment. While today's event is taking place online and we have people joining us from across Turtle Island, the physical homes of the Community Engagement and Research Center and CIPSRT, the Canadian Institute of Public Safety Research and Treatment, are on the territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota First Nations, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. And I think that as we think about how we come together as partners across a lot of different sectors, that model of being treaty people and coming together in a spirit of reciprocity and openness and honesty as treaty people is a really important theme to remember going forward. My name is Shannon Day. As Emily told you, I'm the Dean of Arts at the University of Regina. By training, I'm a philosopher, and I do teaching and research both in philosophy and in gender studies. As it happens, my path to academia was a kind of crooked one that kept taking me in and out of universities. And so that gave me the real advantage that I spent a lot of time between degrees working with community agencies. I did considerable work with sexual health organizations that work on harm reduction and public health broadly construed, and organizations that support prisoners and ex-offenders. And that for me turned out to enrich my work as a professor and a university leader in enormous ways, having those sorts of connections, those kinds of experiences, those kind of trusting relationships. But I'm also aware now, because of some of the administrative work that I do in academia, of what a challenge it can be to establish those relationships if you haven't had that kind of unusual crooked path that I benefited from. Right now, I'm spending a lot of time doing work adjudicating on two national granting councils that decide on funding applications for researchers. And I'm shocked every day by how few applications I see that actually involve partnership between academics and community agencies, even on matters of urgent concern where the community agencies really have enormous expertise and are doing such important cutting edge work. And I don't think that this is because of a lack of will on the part of university personnel. It's very often that if you haven't had that path that takes you in and out of community organizations, if, as is the case with many professors, you've spent your entire career within academia, it can be really overwhelming to think about where do you start to build those relationships. And as everybody attending today will know, establishing trust in those relationships is so crucial and takes so much time, and it's hard to know where to start with that as a member of a university institution. Conversely, for folks who are working in those community agencies and in the public outside of academia, the workload can be so enormous that you just don't even have the capacity to think about how to create relationships with folks in the post-secondary sector. And so I think that the work that is happening in this series and the work that CIRC is doing to facilitate those kinds of relationships is enormously helpful on both sides. So again, this is the third and final in a three-part series. The first two sessions looked at community-based research and looked at knowledge mobilization. And over the course of those sessions, they created some great infographics that explain the key concepts of community-based research and knowledge mobilization, and generated some really helpful links to toolkits and other resources that are available for download. And so if you visit the CIPSRT website, you can access all of that information. And maybe, Emily, at some point you can pop that into the chat as well, so folks can know where to take a look for that stuff. And so here are just a few highlights of the things that came up in the first two sessions. And I started my remarks by talking about some of the challenges for academics, some of the challenges for community partners, and of course there are challenges and opportunities at the intersections. So some of the things that got that came up as questions for creating successful community-university partnerships are some questions for community partners. Do you trust the researchers and believe that they value your expertise? Will you be a true partner? Do you have the resources to be involved in the project, or will you need funding from the researcher? Researchers, I'm going to skip to the bottom of the slide here and then I'll bring it all together. Researchers need to ask themselves, are you prepared to deal with the unique needs of the community partner? Will you need to provide training or resources to have the community partner take part? How integrated an approach do you want to take for knowledge mobilization? And then both sides need to ask themselves, how involved does the community partner want to be in the project? How does the community partner want the findings presented at the end of the project? And what are the timelines or deadlines for the project? So a lot of questions there that you need to ask before you can even begin to form those partnerships. Next slide, please. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us some wonderful expertise to discuss today's theme. Michael Johnny, Yvonne Henson, Nick Carlton, and Casey Ward are joining us today. Michael works with York University, a university that is doing cutting-edge work in the area of partnership development and knowledge mobilization. Yvonne Henson is currently working with University of Saskatchewan, but has worked in the nonprofit world for years and has keen insight into both good and bad university campus research. My colleague Nick Carlton is a professor of clinical psychology, and one of his community partners, Sergeant Casey Ward, works with the Regina Police Service, and they'll speak about their experiences working together. Many people would consider their relationship as a kind of paradigmatic example of best practices in university community partnerships. And I think you're going to get their full bios in the chat as well. So I won't say any more. I encourage you to read those bios. We'll save the time to hear more from our colleagues. So next slide, please. So we're going to guide this panel through three questions, and I'll kind of be nudging them, prompting them to give their answers as we go through. If you have questions you want to ask as well, pop them into the chat. If time permits, then Emily is going to interject periodically to ask those questions as well. Let me start by asking Nick and Casey, what do you think are the key criteria for successful research partnerships?
That's a great question. Casey, do you want to start? Oh, you okay? I think it's. I think the first thing is you want to make sure you're picking great partners. So Casey makes it very easy, for example. But if I was talking more universally, I think probably the three key criteria would be in no particular order: perseverance, humility, and expectation management. I think if you do well on those three fronts, for the most part, the research partnership is likely to be successful. So everybody's got to come to it recognizing they're only bringing a piece of the puzzle, and you're trying to solve a larger challenge. So that's a lot of the humility, and throughout it's a learning process. Every time I get to work with Casey or any of the RPS team members, I learn something new every single time about their world, and they bring such incredible expertise on that front. I also learn a lot about what I don't know even about my own world, because they'll ask questions and I'll stop and go, uh-oh, I better go figure that out because I don't know the answer to that question. And so that requires a lot of perseverance, right? Because there's a lot of learning for everybody involved. And I think it's really important to set good expectations for everybody, just so that everybody knows what to expect from the relationship, what the outcomes will be, what the inputs will be. So those would be my top 3 guesses. But I'd be delighted to hear what Casey thinks too.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, we came into this, when I first started with this, I had some huge expectations. And one of the things I really realized was I had, in the policing role, let's say, we had no real understanding what research was. But on the flip side of that, a lot of the researchers really had no understanding what public safety did. And a lot of times we'd come in with, this is what we wanted done. And we've had researchers saying, this is the research I'm doing. And, when you talk to them about that research and you're saying, well, that's not even what we do, or that's not even the equipment. So Nick is right. It is that understanding, having that open communication. So even though either side might have a great idea, usually that initial first idea isn't where it ever leads to, because things have to be changed along the way. But being able to have those conversations and not worry about it, and just being open to, okay, this is the idea we had, but we're gonna have to change it a little bit to make it work. I had really no understanding about, the parameters around research, and I'd come to Nick with all these ideas and he'd always try to work within them. But, there's certain things that he would say, well, to, get the good quality data, we have to keep it within this age range, or if we try this, we're gonna get too big too fast. So, we've been lucky. Nick actually has become a good friend of mine personally, but with that though, it's just because we would sit down and just talk things out. We'd have an idea and sit there for half an hour and just discuss things, and then together come up with how we're going to proceed.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And it's interesting to hear about the deep knowledge and expertise on both sides and what's involved in bringing that together. Michael, what would you add in terms of, or reinforce in terms of key criteria for successful research partnerships?
Thank you very much. I would certainly echo Dr. Carlson's comments around the values. I mean, coming into a partnership with a degree of humility, perhaps you could say respect, because for academic researchers out there, you are not the ones that create public policy, and you are not the ones that deliver social services or invent products, but your partners do. And you're coming into it with a high degree of specialization that people value. But it's really on an individual basis, the extent to which you can be honest with each other, the extent to which over time you can learn to trust each other. So I'll put in a bit of a plug though. I think the kind of role that I play at York University, and perhaps similar to the role that Lynn Gidlick plays through the Community Engagement and Research Center, of intermediaries, folks that can kind of help bring people to the table and help them develop a clear and common understanding. It's really important in partnership development that you can get clear goals and clear roles. And those roles become really important for the non-academic partner who has interest, but they may have varying degrees of capacity, they may have varying degrees of interest, and in some cases that just simply needs to be managed and supported. Thank you.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Yvonne, let's finish this question with you. What do you think the key criteria are for successful research partnerships?
Yeah, so the role that I've played as of late has been in the area of patient-oriented research, which is similar to community-based research. In that you want to make sure that you actually are following guiding principles, and some of those guiding principles involve authentic relationship building. They involve support. They involve the ability to co-create or co-build the research. So really ensuring that both partners, i.e., research and the patients or the community groups themselves, are building the research from the beginning. The other one is mutual respect. And so Michael and Nick both talked about the need to really ensure that you are acknowledging both partners' experiences and what they bring to the table. So one of the things that I have done when I'm working in community-based research as a researcher is that the work that I have done is oftentimes with lower income groups or groups that work with lower income folks, and ensuring that there is a huge amount of trust and support and acknowledgement for living or lived experience. And so one of those things that can oftentimes go a long ways is providing some support. So whether or not you bring, say, for example, to the table, you bring compensation to the individuals that are part of research teams, making sure that their times are valued. If they need any childcare, if they need any transportation, support to help them to get to being involved with the research team. So those things go a long way when working with community groups.
Thank you so much. Yvonne, something that you mentioned that I think it's the first time it's come up today, but I'll bet it came up earlier in the series, is the co-creation of research. I wonder if anyone on the panel today wants to say a little bit about what it means to co-create research and what the research looks like that is co-created. What sorts of things get co-created?
Michael's got his hand up.
Yeah. I'm happy to jump in. I mean, my role at York, partnerships is central to that. And being able to bring people together at the front end of the research cycle, where questions are not necessarily set in stone, but there are strong mutual interests, I think that really strengthens the partnership overall, and it strengthens the opportunity for that research that's done to have a greater impact. It's certainly something that we, it's a methodology that we employ at York, and there are other universities across the Research Impact Canada network that have brokers or matchmakers that kind of facilitate that co-creation process. It takes a fair amount of time, but like one of our partners within the United Way Greater Toronto has mentioned to me in the past, go slow in order to go far. I mean, if you're really willing to take the time to invest in the relationship, then having some clarity around the scope of the research and the questions really allows for a long runway and a great chance for success.
It's really helpful. So it's about making sure that the partners are out at the table from the start. You're not just tacking somebody on at the end once the project is already fully baked.
If I could also add just a thought on that too, is that one of the things that oftentimes happens when a researcher wants to engage with a community group is they have a preconceived idea of what they would like to see roll out. So they come to a community group, say for example, and say, hey, I'd like to do this research. I'm interested in talking with this group of participants. There are these kinds of participants. What do you think about this? And it kind of seals the deal in a way that a community group is right from the get-go left out of the process of engaging with what that research question might be. So a maybe more open-ended way of coming to a group is, as a researcher, may be, hey, this is the kind of work that I do. This is the kind of interest areas that I have. How would this align with your group in terms of things that you may be interested in and where you might like to see research in this area? And it's a different way of framing the approach. And it allows the community group then to actually engage more fully with the researcher. I mean, this is the kind of way that I think that we oftentimes really need to approach research. It's also, I think, a lot of people that are involved in community groups or as patients or as citizens, they're not clear about the research process. And so spending time with folks to ensure that the research process is well understood, where they might fit into all different parts of the research question, the analysis, the data generation, the knowledge translation at the very end of the project. Where would a community group like to be involved? What is the best use of your time and your resources for doing that? And to make sure that the co-building is really an iterative process that people are apprised at all stages, so that they can see themselves represented, I think is really important.
Thank you so much. Nick or Casey, do either of you want to weigh in on the idea of research co-creation, what that looks like for you?
Sure, I can start. I think I guess there'd be two thoughts that I'd have on it. First of all, the co-creation of research has led to some of the best research pieces that I've done. And so I'll give you just two quick examples. We wanted to try, I want to help police officers and other PSP to do better with respect to their mental health. Well, one of the things we came in with initially was, boy, it's probably a lot to do with a lot of the potentially psychologically traumatic events they're exposed to. And the more that we talked to our community partners, the more I chat, just conversations with Casey and with many of his colleagues, yeah, those are problematic, but there's occupational stressors that are compounding and causing problems. And so just that insight helped us to reframe to go, do we need to take a look at the impact of these other stressors? Just like if we want to provide treatment, one of the things that we didn't realize was so perniciously happening and pervasively happening across the country was you'd get a PSP who would go and see a psychologist, for example, or a counselor, and the PSP would end up consoling the psychologist because the psychologist was having trouble managing what the PSP person had just said. So just those two pieces of insight helped us to build different avenues for doing research to develop solutions that ultimately we hope will help support their mental health. So that's why I'd agree with Yvonne and Michael. I think the broader the question that you bring, the better off you are. So if you say, I'm interested in helping with policing mental health, for example, and you go to your police team and you say, this is what I'm interested in doing, it's a broad enough question that everybody can be involved. And I think the problem for us as academics is that we're very used to the idea that you wouldn't dare go to, for example, a tri-council funding agency without a fully baked idea with right down to the person, like you wouldn't dare do that. But it's actually not true. If you're going to work with your community partners, I think it's better to go, with the idea you want dessert instead of trying to bring a pan of brownies. I don't know, Casey, I don't know what your thoughts are, but
this is the kind of metaphor you get at a lunchtime panel. Yeah, Casey, what's your experience been on your side of things?
Yeah, and it kind of almost leads into the next question a little bit with some of the challenges. But at the start, even kind of before CIPSRT was formed, we had a lot of researchers coming to us saying, this is what we want to do. And they really had no true understanding of what we do or even what we wanted. And that causes a lot of problems. And just being able to sit down and go through and say, this is what the frontline members in PSC really, really want to see done. But the other part of that too, though, is knowing what the researchers can do. Because I think, when I first started, I thought, okay, we can do some research and next thing you know, we'll cure PTSD. And I know that's a bit of a joke, but we always thought that we'd be able to get answers immediately and stuff and understand, the length of the research and stuff. But I totally agree when someone comes, especially when you look at emergency services, a lot of A personalities, when researchers come to us and say, this is what we're going to do, then usually it doesn't work out well. If they come to us and say this, we have some ideas, what do you need? And then hopefully you can put those both together and come up with some great research.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And thank you for what we call in the business a segue. So moving on to the next question, we'll start with Michael this time. Have you experienced challenging research relationships or in your role maybe been aware of some? And if so, how did you or the principals involved address those challenges?
Thank you. The first time I'd heard this question was a couple of years ago at a national community-based research conference. And these were brought up at what they called a failure wake. So we had this conversation at a pub and folks were coming up and basically telling their horror stories. But purposefully, right, to be able to reflect and kind of learn from it. So these answers are going to be a little different, presumably. But yeah, over the years, I've helped to facilitate about 500 research partnerships and relationships, and most of them, quite fortunate, there's a lot of strong, engaged scholars across the country. A lot of them are really like Nick and Casey, where I just do my best work and stay the heck out of the way. But in some cases, they can go off the rails a little bit. And I mean, I let folks know at the beginning that I'm working for both of you. You're both my primary responsibility. So I would sit down and have conversations with each party, acknowledging that issues exist, getting a sense of some balanced feedback. So just unload, if there's a problem, let me know, but what's working well for you? Let's create a bit of balance and a bit of a holistic look at things. Try to bring the team together if so, and really just address it in a very pragmatic way. Let's address, is there a way that we can kind of move past this? But I think the big takeaway for me working within a university setting is I feel really privileged that I'm allowed to take care of the community's interests. Because the university has is well resourced, and there are a lot of mechanisms to take care of each other. But when a community partner is coming in, they're often coming in individually or representing an organization, and they may not have the level of resources and structure and support. So I'm really proud of that, and I think it does help to have somebody that can kind of play that intermediary role. Thanks.
Now, in the 500 partnerships that you've supported, have you noticed patterns in terms of the kinds of things that can go off the rails sometimes?
I wish I could. I mean, firstly, there's not many examples, so I'm not at a point where it's not fingers and toes. It's more, in some cases, it's changed leadership. An organization, there can be a change in leadership, and there can be like a significant pivot. What was a priority 6 months ago is not a priority now. In some cases, while projects, if there's additional funding, additional resourcing, in some cases that can create some challenges too, where, hey, we were working toward A and B, and A and B was important to me, but now we have the resources to do A, B, C, and D. And I feel like A and B aren't top of the list now because the other things, it's kind of shiny and new. So yeah, I mean, I think it boils down to people. So in that case where there's some continuity, things have generally been really positive.
That's excellent to hear. Thank you so much. Yvonne, I'm going to direct the question to you now. Have you experienced challenging research relationships, and what did you do?
So I'm going to answer this question from the point of view of a community group, which a couple of years ago, I was the executive director of an organization that worked in a core neighborhood in Saskatoon in the area of food security. And we did a number of research projects with academics that were coming from mostly University of Saskatchewan, but some from Ontario that were doing like pan-Canadian studies. And one of the things I think that was most challenging for our organization was not always being apprised of where the research was going in between the times where team meetings were happening. So one of the things that we set out fairly early on to address anything that might be a bit of a communication gap was that there was going to be a feedback loop from each of the times where the researcher would, say, for example, assign a student to go out and do participant interviews or something like that. We wanted to know how that had gone. We wanted to be apprised of like the research at all stages. And so that was one way that we wanted to make sure that the communication was consistent with the researcher, because that's one of the things that in my past had been I think a real thorny issue, is that we were, we'd have these really dynamic team meetings around research, and all the parties were there, and we'd kind of go, okay, we've got our action items, and then there'd be literally months that would go on where we had no idea what was going on, if the research was going ahead, and emails were going kind of like, I don't know, into cyberspace and rogue, and we would be communicated back. And I just thought, as somebody that is familiar enough with research, I wasn't going to let my organization sort of like fall down that slippery slope. And so that was one way that we put it out almost in a contractual way, where we just put out really strong principles of how we wanted to be communicated with as a community group that was involved in research.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Nick, what about you?
Well, I don't think I've had a whole lot of failures with respect to I think certainly not catastrophic failures, fortunately. So challenging research relationships. I guess the challenges though would be anytime one of those key principles, if we dropped a ball there. So expectation management failures, or perseverance failures, or humility and respect failures. I think those would be the areas where we ran into where I've seen trouble. I think a lot of it really does come down, the biggest challenges I think really came down to expectation management in the few cases that I'm thinking of. So you need to set those up carefully, right? It's easy, it can be easy for people to misunderstand just the kind of resources that go into various things. So I might say, for example, I'll use Casey as an example. Casey, I want to run this 3-hour survey questionnaire, and I'd like to run it, 3 times a year, and it would be great, and we'd have these fantastic results. And that may all be true, but there are practical realities that Casey is facing then when he goes, okay, Nick, but just imagine what you're talking about there cost-wise to pull a police officer off the road for 9 hours a year. Like this is expensive and difficult. And at the same time, Casey might say, hey, it'd be great if we could run these, 40 different kinds of analysis. He's never done this, but it'd be great if we could run these 40 other analyses, right? And that's okay, but he might not necessarily be aware that each of those analyses is like 12 hours worth of work. So yes, it can be done, but you've just asked for essentially 8 months worth of work to be done. So that expectation management, and I think a lot of that, as Yvonne mentioned, comes down to good communication and regular communication.
Thank you so much. Casey, you got us started on the topic. Do you have more to say about challenging research relationships and how to address those challenges, or maybe how to avoid them altogether?
Yeah, there's just a couple things I want to add. One thing always to remember is when dealing with community groups is, it's not our full-time job. And as much as, a lot of community groups want to help and participate. And sometimes when you do help and participate, it leads to other researchers contacting you saying, hey, I want to do this now, I want to do this. And one thing we saw earlier on is there was a lot of great research that wanted to be done, but our members started getting especially survey tired. And, it's a fine line between, okay, we want to get this research and we want to get answers, but we also don't want to, where our members aren't going to open up an email when we say, hey, can you take the survey? The other thing too, we've had some great relationships. We have had some, previously where, we've had some researchers come up and basically said, this is what we're doing. We disagree. And they said, well, we know better, so we're just going to do it anyways. And what's just going to happen is we're just not going to deal with those researchers anymore. We're going to do the ones that stay and listen to us. But the other thing that at times is when the research is done, is getting back and identifying the key messaging and the knowledge translation, because we get these sometimes 80-90 page reports, and as a community group we're reading through them, but really explain to us what this means, so then we can go back to our members and say, okay, this research is not just giving them an 80-page document, but almost like a 1 or 2 page lay summary in layman's terms saying, this is what the research did, and this is what we want to do with it now, because what is that next step? Because for the most part, when research is done, it leads to, and I've learned this from Nick, another 10 or 12 questions. It usually doesn't conclude it. So, and so what's that next step? We can't probably answer all 12 of those questions, but maybe, what's the most important one, and let, our members know that's where we want to go from here.
That's I like that in a couple of your answers, Casey, you've pointed out that every time you say yes, there are 20 yeses lurking behind that. That's a very good caution. Let me ask the panel about something I didn't hear so much in your answers. I'm curious about something that I hear a lot, or I've become increasingly aware of, is the different pace that time moves in higher ed and in other sectors. Things can take forever in higher ed, and it can feel like nothing's happening because there's so much regulation, so much documentation and so forth required. And so I think sometimes there can be a perception among folks outside of academia that nothing's happening at all. Is that something that any of you have ever encountered in terms of partnership challenges, just those different timelines coming together and having to navigate those differences? Maybe it's just me. I see Yvonne nodding.
Yeah, I think that for sure there's I mean, I guess further to the point of that too is just the understanding of the kind of worlds that people live in too. So a researcher lives in a really different world than a community-based organization that has to do fundraising to establish its reason for being, and there's just always things that come up that are unexpected. Like it blows you away. You know, I was working in an organization where you know, we had a delivery truck, and I'd walk into work, you know, and one day the delivery truck was completely vandalized. So those are the kinds of things that, you know, and I'm sure Casey has had experiences like that, where it just sort of like, your head, you think you're going to walk into work one day and your head is going to be shaped this way and focus this way, and all of a sudden, you just have to completely like devote your time for that day or that week to something completely different. And it can kind of shock you, but you get used to it working in, you know, in the community. But I think that there's tension that can develop between researchers that like to see things move fairly, you know, along a linear path, and then an organization, say for example, that you know, we just have curveballs constantly that we're having to navigate around. So the timelines, I think you're right. Like, I think there needs to be a really open discussion about what timelines look like, and just a greater level of understanding of where everybody, the worlds that we all live in. And that's why worldview is sometimes really important discussions to be having at the research table before you even get off, like, out of the starting block, because we live sometimes in different worlds, and the appreciation that we might have, and that's why I go back to that, like, sort of mutual respect as one of the guiding principles that needs to be there for research. It's going to be a touchstone that you come back to frequently, because those things really rock your world, and they'll rock a research project as well.
It's so important to remember the different kinds of challenges that different personnel face. Just before the session started, when we were all chatting, a few of us were complaining a little bit about working remotely during the pandemic, and Casey said, I don't get to police remotely. And so there are challenges in working remotely and challenges in not working remotely, and we need to be really open about the differences in our roles to support those successful partnerships. Any other thoughts from panelists on the timeline question or the broader question about research challenges before we move on?
Yes, the other thing I'd flag for all of the academic colleagues is make sure that you're really clear with your community partners about the two challenges with time that we run into with ethics boards and publications, right? Because it's something that is just, those are weird things that exist inside academia that some people don't know about until they engage with us, right? And going through an ethics board process can become a huge time sink that no one was planning on. And it can be frustrating, not only for the researchers, but for your partners as to why you're going back and forth through that. And also then the publication process, for as frustrating as it is for the academics, it's more frustrating often for our external partners, because sometimes, for example, I might have a result and I might be able to share that result embargoed with Casey, but Casey needs that for a political decision. And now all of a sudden there's a tension there where I go, but Casey, I can't, like, if it goes too far, then it can't clear peer review. And you want it to clear peer review because it'll have more of a political impact if we wait that period. But as everybody who does this knows, a peer reviewed document can be a 30-day, almost never window, or a 30-month window, right? And that's a lot. That's a lot of variability for our community partners.
There's also one thing that when I was doing sort of some recent training offered to researchers, so there's this, some folks might be aware of it as a theory of a research process. It's called Tuckman's research process, and Tuckman talks about the storming as one of the parts of a research project, in which, so it's like forming, what is it? Forming, norming, storming, and then performing. And so within that storming part, that's oftentimes where challenges will be brought about. So there may be conflict, there may be things that, you know, didn't happen in the earlier stages, then they kind of crop up as real challenges that have to be dealt with. And one of the things that I always say is that research almost always has some conflict built within it. It's how you cope with that conflict. that will really actually make it a stronger process and a product. So it's not something to necessarily be adverse to challenges. It's how you deal with them that is the really important part, I think.
Could I ask you to expand a little further? There'll be some folks listening today who haven't heard that framework before of forming, norming, storming, performing. Can you unpack a little bit what that framework tries to capture?
Yeah, so Tuckman was somebody that, I mean, believe it or not, I think that this theory is quite old. It was brought about, I think, in the 60s, and so it was really about trying to think about the ways in which a research process might flow through a research team. So, say for example, you have your forming, so you pull together all of your partners that have to be involved in a research team, the people that are necessary to be at the table to talk about where you want to go, how do you want to develop your research question, and how you want to see it unfold, and what you're going to do with the end result. And then, in the norming stage, you start to actually move that along. You might see things actually start to develop. So you you do your data generation. You start to bring it out into the community with participants as it needs to, but then you might run into a bit of a hiccup. So as we all know, there is no straight trajectory in life. I have yet to experience it. There's always going to be things that come up that I think that we have to work around. So that's the storming part, and then hopefully the research team and the whoever's assembled around the table to try to shape that into directions that it needs to go. We'll figure that out, and so all of those kinds of discussions need to be had, need to be communicated, need to be thought through, so that you can have success in your ultimate product of your research. So, I mean, we all want to get to the end at some point. We want to see that there is going to be some impact from our research. How many times have I heard community or citizens say, well, what is research? Research never got us anywhere, like blah, blah, blah. But, we have to be able to demonstrate as researchers and as community groups that research had validity. We want to be able to see that it's going to change what we had hoped it would change. And as an agent of social change, we want to be, helping communities move along in what that research was designed to do. So that's the performing part. I hope that that's
really helpful. Thank you. Why don't we move on? And I'm going to start with Michael for this final question, but again, I'm going to prompt everybody at some point. Michael, if you encountered someone, actually you've encountered this 500 times, someone who wants to get involved in community-involved research, whether on the academic side or on the community partner side, what tips would you offer them?
Well, before starting at York, I worked for a community-based organization. I delivered an adult literacy program within an Indigenous community in Hamilton, and I developed my own research interests. So I've 3 tips for folks. The first one is imitate the best. Whether you're in the community sector, if you are a new engaged scholar, reach out within your network, invite somebody for a coffee, and kind of tap into what do they do, but probably more importantly, how do they do it? I know very few folks that are proprietary around their methodology of engaged scholarship. People are happy to share. The second point is learn. There are networks, Community-Based Research Canada, Research Impact Canada. I think across human services sectors, whether it's the United Way, there are learning opportunities to better participate in research opportunities. The third one, and this is a bit more pragmatic for folks that are coming together, is allow for exploratory conversation. For our academic colleagues out there, if you're bringing folks together, create an environment where it's safe for folks to say no, safe for them to say no, where it's like, I'm really interested, but I don't have the capacity. Maybe I know somebody else. Maybe this goes back to time. There's a bit of a just-in-time component. All right, we've all assembled around the table. That means the assumption is we're all good to go. And it's like, you need to go slow in order to go far. And I think you need to create some safety in the environment for folks to say no, or maybe it's just not now. So those are three things that I would share right now.
Thank you so much. And making sure that participants are safe to say no and that you make that transparent to them, I think is so wise and so important. Casey, I'll ask you next. What tips do you offer for folks who want to get involved in community-involved research?
I got a couple ones. One is walk a day in our shoes. I remember being at a CIPSRT conference and talking to a bunch of grad students about some of the research. And I asked them, have you ever been on a ride along? Have you ever been out in a police car? And for them to come see, and we're talking in, with our lens with CIPSRT and, public safety personnel, but it doesn't matter with any community group, to fully understand what they do. So, go work a shift with them, go to their place of business and see what they really do, because you might have an idea of what that research looks like. And then after spending some good time and actually seeing what they do, that probably is going to change it a little bit. And anytime we've ever had, whether it's a researcher or a politician come out for a night, afterwards, the first thing they said is, I had no idea, your job was like this, or, I had this perception that you guys would do more of this sort of thing. So just really get out there. And second, ask her opinion, but if you're going to ask us, mean it. We have been to brainstorming sessions where we sit there and for a full day we plan, they get her opinion, and then we get their research project back, and everything that the the community group that we've said, nothing's in that at all. And at that point, especially in the public safety personnel, like we just get rid of that researcher. We won't do any work with them at all. But I think that's why our relationship with CIPSRT, and especially Dr. Carlton, is why we've formed such a relationship. Is he'll ask, we'll give an answer, and we'll see changes in that research, and come back to us and say, this is what we want to do, but we're doing this now because of what you said, and take that interest. So because there's nothing that makes people more mad is we're basically getting that lip service that we want your opinion, but at the end of the day, the document's already written.
Yeah. Let me ask about that walk or spend a day in our shoes. Does that go both ways? Like, is it important for somebody who's a community partner to get into the Faculty of Arts or into CIPSRT or whatever and spend a little bit of time there as well? Or is it really mainly about getting the researcher out into the community setting?
I do think it goes both ways. Again, because most of this research we're doing is a part-time thing. We do have full-time jobs. It is probably harder to do, but don't want to be a hypocrite here. One of the things that CIPSRT did from the start was explain research to us. And I do think having a good understanding of, I never even really knew what an ethics board was before, or what research had to do, and timelines, and even funding opportunities. And that's the one thing, is a lot of times you'll see researchers want to work with community groups because it usually does help them get those funding opportunities, and it goes both ways. But I do truthfully believe that we have to understand, and once I better understood from talking to Doc Carlton, the capacities for research, timelines and that thing. So yes, absolutely, you need to know what the researchers do, and it does go both ways in any relationship, right? We can't expect the researchers just to come into our house and then disregard what they're doing on their end.
Well, and to be clear, I didn't want to force that answer at all, because you're quite right. It's a really good point that when you're talking about people who are already working full-time jobs in the community, they may not have the capacity or the flexibility to get onto campus, but it's really useful to hear about things like research, ethics approval, and so forth, right?
Absolutely.
Why don't I turn the question to Nick now to get the other side of the coin? What sort of tips do you have to offer, Nick?
I want to echo Casey first and just thank him. And in fact, what he just said as part of a proof in the pudding, right? That led us to co-design with a Research 101 project specifically for PSP that we're now working on doing the next phase release on, so that we would be able to provide an online sort of self-learning training module that was tailored for PSP that fits their needs, so they can go, I get it now. So it's part of how, if you've got a long-standing, like if you develop those long-standing relationships, you can really make big change for everybody involved. You can do good things, and I think that's so important. But to answer your question, I think really it comes down to those big three things initially: respectful humility, perseverant commitment to a common goal, and transparent management of mutual expectations. So if you do those, I think you're probably in pretty good shape. But the one thing that I'd go beyond that to say is it's got to be more than just about the research project. Right? I don't know how, and that could be different for lots of different people. I've got a lot of personal, like for me, a lot of who I am is wrapped up in the work that I do with Casey and all of our PSP community members. Like I'm personally invested. But beyond that, Casey and I are friends. We have a relationship. Like you want to have more than just the project, because I think you need to get to know each other. And if they're longer and longer projects, you're going to need that extant relationship, so that you can manage the challenges that you're going to face together trying to succeed when you're building through the project. Because there will be challenges for any major project that's going to last you more than 2 months. I promise you're going to run into some kind of there'll be a glitch somewhere, pardon me. So those would be my recommendations.
This is really interesting. This theme has been coming through for the whole hour in this discussion, that when we talk about research partnerships, the most important partnership is the relationship, not the particular project. Projects come and go, but relationships take time to cultivate. But those good, trusting relationships then can eventuate in all manner of different kinds of outcomes. You might not even anticipate when the relationship begins. Yeah. Yvonne, what tips do you have for people looking to get involved in community research? What might you add to what you've already heard, or push back on, or reinforce?
Yeah, so I had Emily put up a slide that I prepared. This is not a finite list by any stretch of the imagination. There's probably additional ideas here, but these are a couple of the things that that both for researchers and for community organizations or citizens that that are interested in doing community-based research. These are some of the things that could be applied just to ensure that that things are understood. Just to again come back to that whole notion of co-creation. What are we really talking about, and why is that important? So I think that, like Casey was talking about around foundational, so educating yourself on the organization, its history, its programs, and if possible, yeah, go ahead and volunteer, or do what you need to do so that you really understand the culture of the organization that we're talking about and that you're engaged with. It's really important to see yourself in more than just as the researcher role within that community group.
This is enormously helpful. Are you willing to share the slide with Emily for the group to take a closer look at?
Yeah, absolutely. She can. Yeah, I sent her a slide deck that this is one of the things involved here. Yeah, so she can use it. Yeah.
This is such a useful resource. I'm sorry that I keep giving you the oral exam. I don't mean to keep doing this, but of course you've got the Nothing About Us Without Us logo at the bottom of the slide. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's all about?
Yeah, well, and again, I've worked in the community with people who, for whatever reason, I think that they feel that there's some research exhaustion, and I think it's been referred to by a couple of folks here today too, is that sometimes when people have been researched a fair bit, they're kind of like, well, what did I get out of that? What have I seen that has actually changed in my community for the better? And so really coming back to that imperative of, if we're going to do research that involves people who might quote unquote be in a vulnerable sector, and I don't always like using that language, but I think we know what we're talking about when we say that. that there is a really strong imperative that we make sure that those people are included in the discussion of where that research is going to go, how that research has been designed and taken as a process to actually be a bit more participatory in nature. And so the nothing about us without us. So making sure that people's voices are heard at every stage within that research process is really important. It not only builds credibility for a researcher that does that, but it also builds capacity within the community so that change is possible, and that people actually see the validity of research within their communities. And so that nothing about us is really actually very important.
I thank you so much for being willing to elaborate on that a little bit, because I think that it captures so many of the themes that have come through in our conversation today as well. So it's a kind of brilliant note for us to end on. Again, for participants, oh, sorry, are we going to, no, okay, good. The slides ran away from me for a second. For folks attending today's session, again, these materials will all be available on the CIPSRT website. There's a URL for that in the chat, and I understand that you'll be receiving the recording after the talk as well. Emily will correct me if I'm wrong. Emily, next slide, please. Notice that in addition to all of the amazing resources that have been created over the course of this series and the useful resources and advice that were shared today, the organizers have put together this really handy list of resources as well, from SaneFX and Community First and Carleton and Trent University. So I encourage you to click through and take a look at the wealth of advice and experience that's available there. And finally, I would like to thank all of our brilliant panelists for sharing their wisdom and experience and expertise with us. Thank you to our sponsors, Research Impact Canada, University of Regina, CIPSRT, and the Community Engagement and Research Center. And thanks very much to Lynn Gidlock and Emily Kosick for organizing this amazing series, for all of the amazing work they do in helping to foster these partnerships. And Emily, thank you for being a tech genius and helping us hold it all together in the land of remote seminars. Thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.